Hey guys. Tonight we settle into a story that feels both whimsical and faintly unsettling. The kind of tale that flickers in candlelight rather than blazes in daylight. Imagine a cluttered workshop in West Orange, New Jersey, the late 1880s. The air is thick with sawdust, the faint metallic tang of solder, and the constant hum of restless minds who have stayed up far too late. You see a lantern flicker against the brick walls, throwing long, nervous shadows across shelves stacked with copper coils, glass jars, and bundles of wire. Somewhere in this dim cavern of invention, Thomas Edison bends over a workbench, his wild hair catching the glow like a halo gone slightly crooked. In his hands rests not a new light bulb or telegraph relay, but something smaller, stranger, a doll with hollow eyes and a secret mechanism buried in its chest. You probably don't associate bedtime toys with eerie whispers that sound like a ghost trapped inside porcelain cheeks, and yet that's exactly the path Edison chose one restless night, to give dolls a voice, and perhaps by accident, a reputation for frightening children rather than comforting them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He works slowly, methodically, scratching notes onto the back of a scrap of paper with smudged pencil. The phonograph, the invention that already earned him the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park, sits nearby, a brass horn gleaming in the glow. Its cylinders can capture the trembling notes of human voices, an idea so fresh that even scientists are still arguing whether sound truly lives inside grooves, or if it is more like a ghostly trace of air. Edison peers at the doll, then at the phonograph, and then back again, as though daring them to merge into something nobody asked for. He tests a prototype. A wax cylinder, scarcely larger than your thumb, has been painstakingly cut with grooves. Into those grooves has been forced the faint, high-pitched warble of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The machine inside the doll's chest, a tiny, spring-driven phonograph, presses a needle into the groove, dragging it along, and suddenly the workshop fills with sound. Except it is not the lullaby you expect. It's cracked, shrill, quavering like a nervous soprano trapped in a metal box. The tune wobbles in pitch, and the words dissolve into hiss and scratch. Somewhere between charming and chilling, it hangs in the air. He chuckles, not unkindly. Edison is a man accustomed to experiments that fail more often than they succeed. After all, the light bulb took thousands of filaments to get right. A misbehaving doll's voice is hardly cause for despair. Still, the uncanny echo that fills the lab has a way of settling into the bones, a reminder that sound, though invisible, is deeply physical. Scientists of the time still debate whether phonograph grooves can hold not just sound, but emotion, whether the tremble in a mother's voice could be etched into wax. A young assistant, pale from too much lamp smoke, leans closer to listen. He laughs nervously, muttering something about how the doll sounds possessed. Edison waves him off with a flick of the hand. He insists it will charm them. He imagines children everywhere clutching dolls that speak lullabies at the twist of a crank, a new empire of comfort and innovation. But the dolls, they're different.
Even Edison must admit that. As the night stretches on, the workshop grows quieter. The assistants drift away, and only the faint ticking of a clock and the raspy repetition of the doll's song remain. The shadows grow long, bending toward the door. You can almost hear the house sigh around them, the way old timbers groan when the night is deep. He holds the doll up, listening once more. The tune falters, skips, then starts again. He tilts his head, curious, as though the doll might reveal a secret. Perhaps it already has. That the line between delight and dread is thinner than a groove on wax. And so in this room of sparks and silence, the first chapter of Edison's Talking Dolls begins, not with applause, but with a shiver.
The doll sits on the bench, its porcelain face pale and unreadable, while Edison taps his fingers against the wood in thought. He knows the idea has potential. After all, the phonograph astonished the public. Why wouldn't the same magic tucked inside a child's toy capture their hearts? Tonight, he is determined to refine the process. The tiny phonograph hidden in the doll's torso is no bigger than a teacup, its gears wound tight, ready to squeak out a melody. Edison leans close, fiddling with screws, adjusting the spring so that the grooves might play more smoothly. The recording itself has been made hours earlier. A woman, one of his hired voices, sat before the large recording horn and sang "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into the funnel. Her voice was clear, high, and steady. Yet the moment it was pressed onto the miniature wax cylinder, something uncanny happened. Shrunk and compressed, her gentle song transformed into a warbling, metallic ghost of itself. Edison replays it now. The words stumble, breaking off in hisses and stutters, as though the doll has a sore throat and a mischievous spirit all at once. Here is where science enters the picture in an oddly comic way. The grooves carved into the wax are simply too fine and too fragile. A full-sized phonograph cylinder can hold a voice reasonably well, but reduce that scale and every imperfection magnifies. The tiniest flaw in the groove translates into a shriek, a hiss, or a sudden drop in pitch. Scientists still argue whether Edison underestimated the limits of physics here, or if he simply trusted that his charm with the public could outweigh the shrill reality of the product. He doesn't seem discouraged, though. Edison had been called stubborn more often than brilliant, and for good reason. He believed that even the most impractical contraption could find a market if refined enough. In his notebooks, he scrawled cheerful notes about novelty for the nursery and a revolution in toys. It's almost enduring, imagining this titan of invention, convinced that what the world truly needed was a chorus of dolls shrieking nursery rhymes in unison. Assistants gather around the bench, their eyes darting between Edison and the strange little machine. One of them asks whether parents will actually buy such toys. Edison shrugs. He has always been willing to gamble. Remember how he flooded the streets with electric lamps before proving they were safe? Why not roll the dice with dolls, too? Still, the practical side of him can't ignore the flaws. Wax wears down after a handful of plays, turning the doll's gentle rhyme into distorted static. Worse yet, the spring mechanism requires the child to crank it like a jack-in-the-box, which means more opportunity for the voice to warp and wobble. Imagine a little girl proudly turning the crank only for her beloved toy to croak like an elderly opera singer halfway through the verse. Edison tests another version. This time, he slows the speed, hoping the playback will soften the edges of the sound. It does, slightly. The words linger a little longer, the voice a touch more recognizable.
but the distortion remains. The doll's song floats out like something overheard through a wall, familiar but oddly hollow. And yet, there is magic here too. Think about it. This is one of the very first times in human history that a toy could talk. For millennia, dolls had been silent companions, their wooden, clay, or cloth faces fixed in permanent mute smiles. Now, suddenly, they carried voices, captured forever in delicate grooves. It is both miraculous and unsettling, a reminder that innovation often dances on the line between wonder and unease. One assistant jokes that the doll sounds like a grandmother telling stories through a tin can. Edison laughs, briefly, but his eyes gleam with determination. He doesn't see a failure, he sees a first step. After all, recorded sound itself had once been dismissed as a parlor trick. Who was to say that someday talking toys might not fill every nursery? Outside, the night deepens. Horses clop faintly along the distant road. A cool draft sneaks under the door, ruffling Edison's notes. He barely notices. The doll crackles again, croaking out its nursery rhyme, stubborn and strange. Edison leans close, nodding slowly, as though convinced that what sounds eerie now will sound enchanting tomorrow. And so the experiment continues. More grooves etched, more recordings pressed, more tiny phonographs stuffed into porcelain shells. With each attempt, the lab grows crowded with dolls, rows of them waiting in silence until their strings are pulled. It must have been quite a sight. Edison, the man of light and sound, surrounded by an audience of glass-eyed children who sang only when he cranked their hearts alive. In that moment, the boundary between brilliance and absurdity blurs. Was this the dawn of a playful revolution, or the making of the world's first unintentional horror toy? Scientists still debate whether Edison truly believed these dolls would soothe children, or if he simply saw another chance to test the limits of recorded sound. But in his workshop, with the air thick with smoke and shadows, Edison presses forward, convinced he is giving the world something new.
The workshop smells faintly of oil and singed wood. By now, the bench is crowded with prototypes, some with their porcelain heads tilted awkwardly, others with half-finished torsos exposing the metal guts inside. Edison leans in, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he cranks another mechanism to life. The doll wheezes, sputters, then lets out a cracked version of Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. The rhyme collapses halfway through, turning the cheerful nursery song into something that sounds like a cough mixed with static. This is the problem. Tiny machines make big problems. Edison's assistants take turns winding the toys, each one straining to hear whether the voice is clearer than before. Instead, they hear shrieks, squeaks, and sudden silences. A few laugh nervously, though none dare laugh too loudly. After all, this is their boss, the man who lit up whole cities, yet here he is scowling at dolls. The science is tricky. Phonographs at full scale already push the limits of 19th century materials. A groove only a fraction of a millimeter wide must carry the memory of a human voice, and the slightest wobble of the needle distorts it. Shrink that groove, and you magnify every flaw. The smaller the cylinder, the more the sound warps, like a painting squeezed into a postage stamp. Even the wax itself softens after a few plays, causing voices to slur into whispers.
Scientists still argue whether Edison underestimated this physical limitation or whether he thought sheer persistence could bully physics into behaving. The humor of the situation isn't lost on him. "Well," he mutters one night, "at least they don't complain." He gestures toward a row of dolls, their glass eyes catching the lamplight in eerie silence. His assistants smirk. One even whispers, "Not yet," earning a chuckle that drifts into the rafters. 3 jokes per night keeps the morale alive, and Edison, despite his stern demeanor, knows how to tease a laugh out of fatigue. He tries new adjustments, thickening the wax, sharpening the needle, altering the spring tension. Each change fixes one flaw only to birth another. A slower crank makes voices drag into ghostly moans. A faster one turns lullabies into chipmunk squeals. Imagine a child hugging her doll only to hear it squeak, "Mary had a little lamb," like an overexcited parrot. Not exactly the soothing bedtime companion parents might hope for. Yet Edison refuses to abandon the effort. His philosophy has always been to keep hammering away until an idea either cracks open or cracks him. Remember, this is the man who tested thousands of filaments for the light bulb. If he can endure that, surely he can tame a few cranky dolls. The persistence itself becomes part of the story, a reminder that science is not always a straight march of triumphs, but often a comedy of errors played out in slow motion. He documents everything, scribbling notes about pitch fluctuations, groove depth, and the faint hiss of background noise. To him, these are not signs of failure, but data points, each one another clue in the puzzle. Still, even he has to admit that the dolls sound less like playmates and more like haunted keepsakes. One evening, an assistant winds a prototype too tightly. The spring inside snaps, and the doll shrieks a half-second of nonsense before falling silent forever. The sudden cry is so sharp that everyone in the room jolts, then bursts into laughter. "Well," Edison says dryly, "at least it died singing." The workshop grows crowded with rejects. Shelves sag with dolls whose voices have cracked beyond repair, their wax cylinders worn smooth by too many tests. They sit in silence now, mute witnesses to Edison's stubborn experiment. A visitor walking into the lab might feel unsettled by their vacant stares, like an audience awaiting a performance that never begins. And still, he presses forward. Why? Perhaps because Edison understands something his critics do not. Every flawed attempt contains the seed of a future success. Recorded sound may stumble now, but tomorrow it might dance. And if that means enduring a chorus of shrieking toys in the meantime, then so be it. There is also pride at stake. Edison has been crowned the wizard by the newspapers. Wizards do not fail quietly. They conjure wonders, even when those wonders occasionally look ridiculous. And so he sharpens his tools, cranks the springs, and listens once more to the faltering voices of his porcelain choir. The night stretches on. A candle gutters. Another doll squeaks. Somewhere in the shadows, you can almost hear the future humming along, waiting for Edison's missteps to shape it.
Morning creeps into the workshop like an unwelcome guest, slipping through cracks in the shutters. Edison, hair askew, rubs his eyes as he listens to yet another prototype wail out a broken rhyme. But today isn't just for tinkering. Today, the dolls must meet their audience. He has promised demonstrations,
and parents have brought their curious children to see the miracle of talking toys. The first girl, perhaps 6 years old, approaches shyly. Her curls bounce as she steps forward, guided by her mother's hand. Edison, trying his best to look cheerful, presents her with a doll. Its porcelain cheeks gleam, its dress crisp and carefully sewn. To any casual eye, it looks like the perfect plaything. But the secret waits in its chest. He nods at an assistant who discreetly cranks the mechanism before handing it over. The girl hugs the doll tightly, pressing it to her ear as the voice begins. Instead of a gentle lullaby, the sound is sharp and metallic, words breaking into static as if sung by someone trapped in a pipe. Mary had a little lamb. The girl's eyes widen. She stiffens, confused. Then she frowns and pulls the doll away, holding it at arm's length as though it might bite. Parents exchange uneasy glances. A few chuckle politely, but more than one child recoils. One boy, braver than the rest, declares loudly, "It sounds scary," and the room bursts into nervous laughter. Edison forces a smile, insisting that adjustments are coming, that the dolls will sing more sweetly with time, but inside he feels the sting. He knows charm cannot disguise physics. The reactions ripple outward. Reports spread quickly. Children frightened, parents unimpressed, dolls whispering like ghosts. What was meant to be enchanting now seems unsettling. Scientists still argue whether Edison should have seen this coming, or whether his boundless optimism blinded him to how the public would hear these voices. After all, to him, they were marvels of engineering. To children, they were simply creepy. And the humor isn't lost on the staff. One assistant quips, "At least we've invented the world's first anti-sleep toy." Another adds, "Perfect for chasing nightmares, or causing them." Even Edison chuckles, albeit through gritted teeth. If failure must come, at least let it arrive with laughter. The dolls themselves continue to perform, one after another, each cracking and wheezing their way through nursery rhymes. Some lose their voices halfway, sputtering into silence mid-sentence. Others speed up unnaturally, turning a lullaby into a jittery chant. Imagine being a child and hearing your toy bark out a song like a breathless bird. It doesn't exactly inspire comfort. One mother tries to soothe her daughter, encouraging her to hug the doll again. The child refuses, shaking her head violently. She clutches her old, silent rag doll instead, burying her face in its stitched fabric as though seeking refuge from the new, noisy intruder. The message is clear. Silence, it turns out, is sometimes kinder than sound. Yet, amid the awkwardness, Edison remains composed. He explains the mechanism to fascinated onlookers, his voice steady. He shows them the tiny cylinders, the delicate grooves, the miniature needles. He frames the dolls as marvels of science rather than playthings, hoping, perhaps, that wonder will outshine discomfort. And indeed, some adults are impressed. They lean in, nodding, marveling that human voices could be captured at all. But the children, the intended customers, remain unconvinced. It is a peculiar sight. Rows of dolls lined up on the table, their porcelain faces expressionless, while children shrink back from their hollow voices. Edison sees the disconnect clearly now. He has built a technological wonder, yes, but perhaps not a toy. The dolls were supposed to comfort. Instead, they unsettle. And there lies the heart of the problem. Outside, a cart rattles past, its driver shouting cheerfully.
The sound is warm, natural, human. Inside, the dolls croak in mechanical unison. The contrast could not be sharper. Edison, ever the optimist, makes a note to himself: improve clarity, extend durability, refine playback. But another thought lingers unspoken. Maybe some inventions, no matter how clever, belong to a different audience altogether. And as the children shuffle out, clutching their parents' hands tightly, the dolls remain behind, staring with their glass eyes, silent until the crank is turned again.
The workshop feels heavier now, as if the air itself carries the weight of disappointment. Edison sits at his desk, piles of notes scattered before him, sketches of doll mechanisms curling at the edges. His assistants avoid eye contact, pretending to be busy with wires and springs. The echoes of children's frightened voices still linger in the room, like smoke that refuses to clear. Edison is not a man easily rattled. He has weathered ridicule before. Remember the phonograph itself? Many scientists dismissed it as a mere parlor trick. Yet this sting is different. The talking doll was supposed to charm families, not unsettle them. Newspapers had already run headlines announcing the miracle toy. Investors expected profit. And now what should have been a triumph looks more like an embarrassment. He picks up one of the dolls, cradling it in his calloused hands. Its porcelain face stares blankly, refusing to share his frustration. He cranks the spring, and once again the tiny voice croaks, "Now I lay me down to sleep." The words wobble, breaking into static midway, and then collapse into silence. Edison sighs. Even his stubborn optimism falters. The financial side is grim. Hundreds of dolls had been produced, each expensive to make. The intricate phonograph mechanism alone cost more than the doll's dress and porcelain head combined. Parents balked at the price, especially for a toy that frightened rather than comforted. Some dolls were returned, others simply abandoned in closets, their voices worn to whispers after a few plays. Scientists still argue whether Edison truly miscalculated the business risk, or whether he simply refused to admit defeat until the losses piled up too high. The humor of the situation isn't lost on the press. Cartoons depict children running from shrieking dolls, mothers frowning at mechanical lullabies. One satirical paper dubbed them Edison's Nightmare Choir. His competitors snicker, and even some of his own investors raise eyebrows. Edison, usually so eager to defend his inventions, falls uncharacteristically quiet. He buries himself in other projects, lamps, batteries, and telegraphs, leaving the dolls to gather dust in the corner of his lab. Yet he cannot entirely let go. On late nights, when the lab is silent except for the ticking clock, he sometimes winds one up just to listen. The cracked voice fills the room, eerie but strangely tender. Perhaps he hears not failure, but possibility. After all, the principle is sound. Voices can be preserved, carried, replayed. The flaw lies only in the scale, in the mismatch between invention and expectation. His assistants notice his lingering attachment. One teases gently, "Maybe the dolls aren't for children, maybe they're for scaring burglars." Another adds, "At least they'll never interrupt you, boss." Edison smirks, but his eyes betray fatigue.
He knows when to retreat. This, finally, is one of those times. The dolls are quietly withdrawn from the market. No press release, no grand announcement. They simply vanish from store shelves, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. A few are salvaged by collectors, tucked into cabinets where they sleep undisturbed. Others are dismantled, their phonograph parts recycled into more practical machines. Yet the lesson lingers. Edison, the man known for relentless persistence, has discovered that even he must sometimes bow to reality. His talking dolls are a flop, a reminder that not every idea, no matter how clever, finds its audience. And yet, in the larger story of invention, even failures carve paths forward. The grooves of those tiny cylinders, warped and fragile, hint at futures still waiting to unfold. For now, though, the dolls sit in silence, a small chorus of ghosts haunting the workshop. Their porcelain faces glimmer faintly in the lamplight, as though mocking their maker with mute smiles. Edison gathers his notes, shoves them into a drawer, and moves on. But deep down he knows the world has not heard the last of recorded voices, only the last of them coming from children's toys.
The laboratory quiets after the dolls vanish from shop shelves. But behind that silence hums another story, not of Edison himself, but of the many unseen hands that kept those tiny phonographs turning. In a back room of the factory, rows of women sit at benches, their skirts brushing against oil-stained floors, their hands delicate yet disciplined. They are the voice artists of Edison's experiment, though no one calls them that. Instead, they are workers, hired to lean close to the machines and recite nursery rhymes into the delicate recording horns. Picture it, a narrow room lit by flickering gas lamps, the air thick with wax dust and hot metal. One young woman, perhaps no older than 19, presses her lips toward the brass cone and murmurs, "Mary had a little lamb." Her voice wavers as the stylus scratches fragile grooves into a thin wax cylinder. She coughs once, laughs nervously, then begins again. Multiply her effort by dozens, repeated for hours. A doll's voice is born not from Edison himself, but from this hidden chorus. The process is fragile. If her voice pitches too high, the grooves distort. If she speaks too softly, the playback is swallowed in static. One sneeze at the wrong moment ruins an entire recording. And when the playback mechanism finally echoes her words, it's her voice, distorted, metallic, uncanny, that tumbles from the doll's mouth. Imagine a little girl in 1890 cradling a porcelain figure that croaks in the voice of a factory worker from Newark. That odd intimacy unsettles more than it soothes. Scientists still argue whether Edison truly believed this system could ever scale. Each doll needed its own hand-recorded cylinder. No mass duplication existed yet. Every rhyme, every lullaby was unique. No two dolls spoke quite the same. What sounds magical to us now was in business terms a nightmare. Imagine trying to meet holiday demand when every toy had to be sung to individually by exhausted women in dim rooms. One odd rumor survives in factory lore. Some workers claimed the dolls absorbed their moods, On days when the women were cheerful, the playback seemed less terrifying, still eerie, but somehow lighter. On days when exhaustion dragged them down, the dolls groaned with a despairing edge. Of course, that's superstition. Or maybe it's just what happens when human voices meet fragile technology. But it makes you wonder, could the dolls have carried not only words, but fragments of the workers' fatigue, their longing, their laughter? There's a faint joke in all this, too. Imagine being one of those women paid to read the same 6 rhymes hundreds of times a day. By the end of the shift, they must have muttered the words in their sleep. Perhaps they startled awake at night, convinced a doll was whispering, "Now I lay me to sleep," from the corner of the room. And perhaps, in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. Edison rarely entered that recording room. He left supervision to managers, focused instead on grander experiments. Yet without those women, his invention had no voice. They are the hidden authors of his failure. Their anonymous tones carried across decades. Today, when collectors play the surviving cylinders, what we hear is not Edison's genius, but the faint breath of long-forgotten workers. Their voices are ghostly, yes, but also profoundly human. In the end, the curtain hides more than it reveals. The dolls become remembered as Edison's idea, his embarrassment, his eerie misstep. Few recall the rows of women bent over brass horns, giving life to porcelain mouths. Their story fades into the background, just as their actual voices did when the grooves wore out after a few plays. But if you listen closely, really closely, you can almost imagine them still, a chorus of weary singers whispering lullabies that no child ever truly wanted to hear.
The dolls may have failed in the marketplace, but the echoes of that misstep linger in Edison's restless nights. He paces his laboratory, oil lamp in hand, muttering about the future of recorded sound. The shelves around him are cluttered with fragments, broken cylinders, cracked porcelain heads, discarded clockwork mechanisms. They form a kind of mechanical graveyard, silent yet oddly judgmental, as though dozens of eyeless doll faces are staring back at him. He mutters to his assistants about improvement. Perhaps a tougher wax could hold the grooves longer. Perhaps a miniature diaphragm could make the voice clearer. The logic is sound, but the practicality is laughable. Each doll still requires its own personal recording, a ludicrous bottleneck for a man obsessed with scaling inventions to the masses. He knows it, but his pride won't allow him to admit it. Not yet. One mainstream fact sits in the middle of this scene. By the late 1880s, Edison had already perfected the phonograph enough to play music, speeches, and opera arias. It was a marvel, a machine that could trap the human voice and summon it back at will. He thought applying the same idea to toys was clever marketing. Yet the cruel twist is that the most advanced part of the doll, its recorded voice, was also the most fragile and most frightening. And here's where the story turns quirky. One of Edison's assistants reportedly tested the dolls at night, lining them up in rows and playing them one after another. Imagine that sound. 20 porcelain children in eerie unison croaking hickory-dickory-dock. The effect must have been less like a lullaby and more like a seance. You probably wouldn't want to hear that after midnight with the lamps dimmed low. But Edison insisted it was progress. Scientists still argue whether Edison ever took the dolls seriously as a long-term product. Some suggest he always knew it was a side project, an experiment in miniaturizing his phonograph. Others argue he saw dollar signs, hoping to expand into toys as aggressively as he had into light bulbs and telegraphs. Whatever the truth, he never liked the word failure. Instead, he'd shrug, call it a lesson, and move on, though the factory bills told a different story. One fringe tidbit often overlooked: a few dolls were shipped overseas, to Paris and London. Reports trickled back of children who received them. In at least one case, the parents wrote that their daughter burst into tears the moment the doll rasped its rhyme. Another account claimed a child refused to sleep with the doll in the room, convinced it was possessed. We can smile gently now, but in that Victorian nursery, the fear must have felt real. Edison, ever the showman, continued to demonstrate the dolls for visiting reporters, winding them up with a grin that sometimes looked a little forced. He would hold the doll close to the journalist's ear, as if unveiling a miracle. The doll would croak, the journalist would recoil. The demonstration ended in polite laughter, scribbled notes, and soon enough, biting reviews. But perhaps the strangest image is this. Somewhere, hidden in a box in the corner of Edison's cluttered workshop, dozens of these failed dolls sat untouched after production ceased. Imagine them waiting silently, each one carrying the unique voice of an anonymous factory worker, each one capable of springing back to life with the crank of the handle. For Edison, they were reminders, awkward porcelain ghosts of an idea that never learned how to speak properly. He moves on to other inventions, to grander headlines. But the dolls remain there, quietly gathering dust, a chorus of missed potential. They remind us that science is never a smooth arc of triumphs. It's littered with oddities, misfires, and yes, toys that terrified the very children they were meant to comfort. And in a way, that's comforting for us too, because it means even the great Edison, wizard of Menlo Park, master of electricity, once tried to give the world talking dolls and ended up giving nightmares instead.
By the time the dolls were quietly pulled from shelves, Edison had already spun himself into the next whirlwind of experiments. That was his nature, always forward, rarely pausing to sit with embarrassment. Yet the odd legacy of those dolls lingered, not just in factory ledgers, but in whispered conversations and bemused newspaper clippings. Some editors poked fun, calling them the doll that growled, while others treated the story like a quirky novelty, sandwiched between updates on steamships and weather reports. Still, late at night, in his dim workshop, Edison sometimes tested the dolls himself. He'd pick one up, wind the mechanism, and listen as the scratchy voice wheezed out, "Now I lay me down to sleep." The irony was almost comical. Here was the man who lit entire cities, who electrified theaters, who sent sound across the globe, reduced to listening to a toy that could barely get through a nursery rhyme. You probably wouldn't envy him in that moment, especially when the doll ran out mid-sentence, stuttering into silence. Mainstream fact: the dolls marked one of the earliest attempts to mass-market recorded sound, predating the modern record industry by decades. Even though they flopped, they planted a strange seed that sound could be portable, personal, even packaged for children. Later generations of toy makers and even music distributors would succeed where Edison faltered. The idea itself wasn't useless. It was simply premature. But here's a fringe tidbit. Some collectors swear that when you play one of the surviving dolls today, it doesn't just sound eerie,
It feels uncanny, as though the voice carries static from another world. Scientists still argue whether this effect is purely mechanical, wax degradation, groove wear, or if there's something about the human brain that reacts instinctively to distorted speech. After all, our ears evolved to detect subtle patterns in voices. When those patterns go wrong, our imagination fills the gap with unease. Edison's rivals, of course, loved the mishap. They already called him arrogant, and the doll debacle was easy ammunition. One rival quipped that Edison had invented the first nightmare in a box. Another suggested he stick to bulbs and batteries instead of bedtime companions. Edison, characteristically, ignored the jabs, at least in public. Privately, though, his notes show frustration. He scribbled about better recording mediums, improved diaphragms, sturdier cylinders. He was still thinking about the dolls long after the newspapers moved on. And here's where the story slips toward the peculiar. Imagine Edison walking through his cluttered workshop, brushing past phonographs, wires, and discarded prototypes, when he catches the faint echo of a doll's playback from a corner. He knows no one else is there. He winds it down, chalks it up to imagination, and moves on. But it's easy to picture him lingering a moment longer, lamp raised, surrounded by porcelain faces that never quite smiled back. One might laugh at this, but the image is almost poetic. For all his triumphs, Edison's legacy isn't just glowing bulbs and humming power stations. It's also these failed experiments, reminders that invention is messy, awkward, and occasionally unsettling. The dolls didn't just scare children, they humbled a man who thought he could bend sound itself to his will. Perhaps the strangest joke is this: more than a century later, we still talk about them. Not his countless patents, not his financial conquests, but these odd little toys that groaned bedtime rhymes like exhausted ghosts. In their failure, they achieved a kind of immortality Edison probably never expected. And so, in the grand symphony of Edison's life, the dolls are a dissonant note, brief, jarring, but unforgettable. They remind us that even the brightest minds can stumble, and sometimes those stumbles echo longer than the victories.
The dolls may have vanished from shop windows, but their story did not simply end. Instead, they took on a second life, less as toys and more as curiosities whispered about in drawing rooms and written up in odd corners of Victorian newspapers. For a brief season, they became the butt of gentle jokes, the kind that a polite society could chuckle over after dinner. Imagine a well-dressed gentleman pulling one from a box, winding the crank and letting guests hear a childlike voice rasp out, "Jack and Jill." Gasps, laughter, maybe a nervous shiver. The doll was less a plaything and more a party trick. And so the talking dolls drifted into the margins of cultural memory. One mainstream fact here: Edison's venture into dolls marks one of the earliest commercial intersections of science and entertainment. He didn't just want to harness electricity, he wanted to sell wonder, to make people feel astonished in their own parlors.
That instinct worked brilliantly with the phonograph and electric light, but with dolls it backfired spectacularly. Instead of wonder, he conjured unease. The fringe tidbit is this: not all of the dolls disappeared. Some sat unsold in warehouses, others were quietly stashed away by curious buyers. A few survived, and today they fetch astronomical prices at auction, not because they're charming, but because they are so peculiar. To hold one is to cradle both history and absurdity, a relic of science that aimed for delight and landed closer to horror. Scientists still argue whether the surviving cylinders should even be played. Each spin risks grinding away fragile grooves forever. Should we preserve the artifact silently or dare to hear its voice one more time? It is an odd fate for Edison's invention. In trying to comfort children, he created something that would one day haunt museums. Picture the dim hush of a museum gallery, porcelain heads behind glass, tiny dresses frayed with age, and, if you're lucky, a faint recording piped through a speaker. Visitors lean in, expecting sweetness, and instead hear a distorted murmur that sounds halfway between a lullaby and a warning. A child giggles nervously. An adult mutters, "Well, that's unsettling." Everyone remembers it. Here's a little modern aside. Think about your own childhood toys. Maybe a teddy bear that lost an eye, or a wind-up toy that squeaked more than it should. Now imagine that toy speaking in the voice of a stranger from 1890. You probably wouldn't have kept it on the pillow next to you. And yet, some Victorian parents insisted their children would get used to it. Spoiler, most never did. Edison himself rarely mentioned the dolls in later years. They didn't fit neatly into his mythology of genius. He liked to be remembered for lighting cities, not for frightening toddlers. And so the dolls slipped into the shadows of his story. But shadows have a way of drawing attention. The stranger and quirkier the invention, the longer it seems to echo. Even now, more than a century later, the dolls whisper through history, not in soothing tones, but in distorted fragments, like forgotten recordings that refuse to be silent. They remind us that failure can be just as fascinating as success, and sometimes much more entertaining to tell at bedtime.
By the closing years of the 19th century, the dolls had been written off as a curiosity, a cautionary tale in the long ledger of Edison's projects. Yet, in their quiet failure, they cast a strangely long shadow. The shelves of Menlo Park had been cleared, the workers reassigned, the porcelain faces boxed away. But the memory of those odd little voices lingered. For some, they symbolized Edison's hubris. For others, they were proof that even a genius could trip over his own cleverness. And for a select few collectors, they became treasures, fragile portals into an age when science and imagination collided in porcelain and wax. Here lies the mainstream fact. Edison's talking dolls are considered by historians to be the first attempt at bringing recorded sound into everyday domestic life. Long before radios crackled in kitchens or gramophones filled parlors with song, there were dolls rasping lullabies to startled children. That experiment, though bizarre, pushed the boundary of what recorded sound could be. It proved that technology could slip from laboratories into living rooms, though perhaps not yet into nurseries. And the quirky tidbit? Some of Edison's notebooks hint he considered other speaking toys. Sketches suggest mechanical animals, perhaps a bird that could chirp a recorded song, or a miniature phonograph embedded in a toy trumpet. None of these reached production, but the idea was there. A world where even playthings could carry captured voices. Scientists still argue whether these scribbles were serious proposals or just passing thoughts, but it's tempting to imagine a whole menagerie of unsettling Victorian toys that never quite came to life. Still, the dolls left their mark. Modern researchers replay their surviving recordings, carefully digitized, and find themselves both amused and unsettled. The voices wobble, falter, and crackle across more than a century, as though the past itself is trying to speak. It is eerie, yes, but also tender. Each distorted lullaby carries the breath of a long-forgotten factory worker, still whispering across time. And so the story drifts toward its end. Edison moved on to brighter inventions, and the dolls became historical footnotes. But they endure in memory, not because they succeeded, but because they failed in such a spectacularly odd way. They remind us that progress is stitched together not only from triumphs, but from experiments that didn't quite land, ideas that sputtered, faltered, and sometimes groaned like a porcelain child at midnight. Now, picture this. The laboratory is quiet. The lamps burn low, and on a dusty shelf sits one forgotten doll. Its key is unwound, its voice forever trapped in wax, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to play it again. It will never be loved as a toy, but it will always be remembered as a story.
And now, as our journey closes, let the pace soften, like lamplight dimming in a quiet workshop. The voices of the dolls grow fainter, slipping back into the shadows where they belong. The cluttered shelves of Menlo Park fade, the porcelain faces blur, and what remains is only a hush, a calm, steady hush. You can imagine the dolls packed away in their boxes, stacked neatly, their tiny dresses folded, their cylinders resting still. There's no more rattling, no more rasped rhymes, no more uneasy laughter from children startled awake, just silence, deep and steady. Breathe with that silence. Feel the strange edges of the story smoothing into something softer. Every invention, no matter how odd, eventually comes to rest, and so do we. The world, with all its experiments, with all its noise, slows down at the edges of night. The voices you've heard tonight, scratchy and distant, were never meant to frighten you. They were simply attempts, fragile attempts at wonder. In that thought there is comfort. Even the most unsettling echoes are born from human hands reaching for connection, reaching for magic, reaching for something more. So, as your eyes grow heavy, let the story dissolve into the background hum. Imagine the steady tick of a clock, the soft breath of air moving through a quiet room, the faint vibration of life carrying on. All around you, the world rests. The dolls are quiet now. The factory is dark. Edison has gone home. What remains is your own stillness, your own calm, your own sleep.
Let go, drift gently, and dream of softer inventions, kinder voices, and a night that holds you in safety.